The late autumn air carried a familiar chill, the kind that bit through wool coats and settled deep in the bones, but on this particular Tuesday, it was a sensation William welcomed. For 23 years, the rhythm of his life had been dictated by the seasons of the railway, and this morning, the season was ending. He stood on the worn platform of Doncaster Station, a place that had become his second home. The scent of diesel, damp concrete, and rain-soaked gravel a perfume he'd long since stopped noticing. His hands, gnarled and calloused from a lifetime of labor, rested on the brass railing that overlooked the sprawling network of tracks. In the distance, a horn sounded, a low, mournful bellow that was the language of his world. He was not a man of many words. His life had been one of action, of silent competence. He'd started as a junior shunter at 17, fresh-faced and eager, learning the heavy language of coupling and decoupling, of signaling with lamps in the dark. He'd risen through the ranks, his quiet dedication noticed by foremen and supervisors who valued a man who didn't complain, who simply did what needed to be done. For the last 12 years, he'd been a driver, his hands guiding the great diesel engines across the northern routes, from the steel city of Sheffield out to the coastal plains of Hull, and up through the rugged Pennines to Leeds. He knew every gradient, every signal box, every peculiar shudder and groan of his locomotive, number 4472's younger cousin, a Class 56 he'd come to know as Bertha. His life outside these rails was a quieter affair. A modest terraced house he shared with his wife, Margaret, a woman whose laughter was as warm as the tea she'd pack in his thermos every morning. Their children were grown, with families of their own in Australia and Canada, their departures marked by tearful goodbyes at this very station. They sent photos and emails, but the distance was a constant low ache. The railway had been his constant, his second family, a network of signalmen, station staff, and fellow drivers who had become his brothers. They shared the graveyard shifts, the white-knuckle moments of winter blizzards, and the quiet pride of a train arriving on time against all odds. But the railway was changing. The old guard was retiring, replaced by digital screens and centralized control centers. The camaraderie of the depot, the smell of engine oil and strong tea in the mess room, was being replaced by the sterile efficiency of tablets and electronic logbooks. When the letter had arrived confirming his retirement date, he'd felt a strange numbness, not sadness, but the hollow echo of an identity being dismantled. He was William the train driver. Who was he without the rumble beneath his feet? His final shift had been scheduled as a quiet run. The 6:45 from Doncaster to London King's Cross, a route he knew with his eyes closed. But the week leading up to it had been anything but quiet. Margaret had noticed the shift in him. He was more withdrawn, spending long hours in the small shed he'd converted into a workshop, meticulously polishing a brass locomotive model he'd had since he was a boy. He'd taken long walks along the old track beds that had been converted into nature trails, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the rails once ran. It was on one of these walks that the idea began to form. He passed a group of schoolchildren on a field trip, their faces pressed against the fence as a high-speed train thundered past. One boy, no older than 7, had waved frantically. William had raised a hand in return, a reflex he'd perfected over decades. The boy's face had lit up with an unfiltered joy that struck William with unexpected force. He remembered that feeling, the pure magic of a train, of the journey, of the promise of somewhere else. He had spent a lifetime being a part of that magic for thousands of people, a silent, unseen figure in the cab, responsible for their safety and their journey. The idea solidified into a quiet plan. He wouldn't tell anyone. He didn't want fanfare or speeches. He wanted something that felt true to who he was. He contacted the station master, a younger man named Davies whom he respected for his old-school sensibilities. He asked for a favor, a deviation from the standard retirement protocol. Mr. Davies, after a moment of surprised silence, had agreed without hesitation, a knowing look in his eyes. William spent his last evening off in his shed, not polishing but writing. He wrote in a steady, deliberate hand on thick, cream-colored paper. He wrote of the beauty of the dawn breaking over the moors, of the thrill of a clear run after a signal failure, of the quiet responsibility of carrying people's lives in his hands. He wrote not in technical terms, but in the language of a man describing a lifelong love affair. He wrote a dozen letters, each one addressed simply to a young traveler. His final shift began in the inky blackness of a 4 a.m. start. The depot was quiet, the other drivers offering nods of acknowledgement, a few clapping him on the shoulder. He performed his pre-start checks with a ritualistic reverence, his hands moving over Bertha's controls with a finality that felt sacred. As he guided the train out of the depot and into the main station, the first pale light of dawn was just beginning to seep over the rooftops of Doncaster. The station platform was a tableau of early morning life. Businessmen with briefcases, students with backpacks, families with children clutching toys. William leaned out of his cab, his eyes scanning, not for signals but for them. And there they were, a young couple, their arms full of luggage, their faces etched with the nervous excitement of travelers. Beside them, holding his mother's hand, was a little boy with a shock of red hair, his eyes wide as he stared up at the massive locomotive. As William brought Bertha to a silent, graceful halt, the brakes hissing their familiar sigh, he felt the weight of the moment. He opened the cab door, stepped down onto the platform, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't the invisible driver. He was just a man in a worn blue coat and a flat cap. He walked towards a young family. The little boy, whose name he would later learn was Leo, stopped and stared, his mouth forming a smile. William crouched down, a difficult maneuver for his stiff knees, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. He pulled from his coat pocket one of the letters, the envelope crisp and clean. He also held a small, polished brass button, a spare from an old uniform, its surface warm for being held in his palm. "Hello," William said, his voice gravelly but gentle. "My name is William. I drive this train. I heard you were going on a journey today, and I thought you might like something for the trip." He held out the letter and the button. Leo looked from William's weathered face to the treasures in his hand, then up at his parents, who watched with bemused, curious smiles. The father gave a small, encouraging nod. Leo reached out, his small fingers closing around the button first, feeling its weight, then taking the letter. "This is for you," William continued. "It's a story about a train journey. And that button, well, that's a bit of magic. It's from a train driver's coat. It's kept the train safe for 1,000 journeys. Now it can keep you safe on yours." He straightened up, his knees protesting, and tipped his cap to the parents. "Have a wonderful journey." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back towards his cab, the ritual complete. As he climbed back into his seat, he saw Leo's mother kneeling beside the boy, carefully opening the letter. He started the engine, the familiar rumble a comfort. As the train began to pull away from the platform, he glanced in his side mirror. He saw Leo, his small face illuminated by the rising sun, holding the brass button up to the light, a look of pure, unadulterated wonder on his face. That was the image he carried with him as Bertha pulled out of the station, heading south, leaving his old life on the platform behind. Document 2, the news didn't travel fast. It traveled the way authentic things do, quietly, from one person to another, gathering weight and truth with each telling. By the time the 6:45 from Doncaster reached its first stop at Retford, the story had begun to weave itself through the carriages. A passenger who had witnessed the exchange from a nearby window told the man beside her. That man, a local journalist heading to London for a conference, recognized the seed of something special. He didn't reach for his phone to post it online. Instead, he simply watched, feeling the need to let the moment breathe. Meanwhile, in a quiet first-class carriage, Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales, sat with a cup of tea, looking over briefing notes for a series of engagements in the capital. Her life was a carefully managed tapestry of public duties, private moments, and the constant, subtle navigation of her unique position. Beside her, her husband, Prince William, was engrossed in a book about polar exploration, a rare moment of stillness in their perpetually moving lives. The train's gentle sway was a lullaby, and the world outside the window, was a blur of autumn fields and hedgerows. Kate, ever observant, noticed a ripple of unusual energy pass through the carriage. A hushed conversation, a few passengers glancing toward the front of the train, smiles exchanged. She nudged William with her elbow, a silent gesture that said, "Something's happening." He lowered his book, his eyes following hers. A conductor was walking through, his usual perfunctory manner replaced by something softer. He was leaning in to speak with passengers, pointing towards the locomotive, and, in his hand, he held several cream-colored envelopes. He approached their carriage last, a slight hesitation in his step as he recognized them. "Your Royal Highnesses," he began, his voice low. "I do apologize for the intrusion. There's something of a tradition starting today, it seems. Our driver, William, he's on his final journey. Retirement. He's leaving these letters for young passengers. He asked me to distribute them. It's a bit unusual, but Kate's interest was immediately piqued. A letter for a young passenger?" she asked, her voice warm and encouraging. "That's a beautiful gesture." The conductor nodded, a genuine smile breaking through his professional demeanor. He's been on these rails for over 40 years. A real character is William. Quiet as a mouse, but everyone knows him. He's done this for a few children already this morning. They say he gives them a brass button, too. A bit of luck from the engine. He glanced down the carriage. "We've no little ones in here, but the spirit of it, well, it's rather lovely, isn't it?" After the conductor moved on, William and Kate exchanged a look. It was a look born of years of partnership, a silent conversation that needed no words. They both understood the weight of a quiet legacy, the profound impact of an authentic, unpublicized act of kindness. This wasn't a stage photo opportunity or a charity gala. It was a man, in his final hours of a life's work, choosing to leave a piece of his soul behind for strangers. They both recognized, the very definition of duty, stripped of all pomp, and presented in its purest form. William, whose own sense of purpose was so often framed by grand historical narratives, felt a deep resonance. His life was about legacy, about the continuation of a line. Here was a man crafting his own legacy, not in marble or in state documents, but in the heart of a child on a train. It was humbling. Kate, whose approach to her public role was defined by genuine connection and a deep-seated empathy, was touched by the simple, human poetry of it. She thought of her own children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and how such a small thing, a letter, a button, could become a cherished artifact, a story told for years. She looked at William. "We should meet him," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly. "At King's Cross. When we arrive." Quietly. The rest of the journey was different for them. The briefing papers and the book were set aside. They watched the other passengers, noticing the quiet smiles, the parents reading the letters to their children. They saw a teenage girl, probably around Charlotte's age in a few years, holding her brass button with a reverence that was touching. The train, usually a vessel for transit, had become a vessel for connection, its steel heart beating in time with 100 small, personal revelations. When they arrived at the cavernous expanse of King's Cross, the usual chaos was momentarily paused for them. Security personnel and palace aides created a discreet bubble, but the couple's focus was not on the waiting cars or the pre-planned route. They made their way not towards the grand exit, but towards the far end of the platform, where the locomotive was being uncoupled. They found him there. William the driver. No, just William now, was standing beside Bertha, his hand resting on her warm, soot-flecked side. He was speaking to a young technician, his instructions quiet and clear. He wasn't looking at the station's grand architecture or the throngs of people. His gaze was fixed on the engine, a private farewell. The security detail hovered, uncertain. William stepped forward, his hand raised to signal they should wait. He approached slowly, not as a prince, but as a man who understood the sanctity of a final moment. "William," he said, his voice soft. The driver turned, his face creased with confusion, then dawning recognition. He saw the two figures standing a respectful distance away, the quiet efficiency of the protection officers, and his eyes widened. "Sir? Mung." He fumbled for his flat cap, which he'd left on the driver's seat. I didn't, please," Kate said, stepping forward. "Don't. We wanted to thank you." William, the driver, was utterly nonplussed. His life had been about staying in his cab, about the tracks and the signals. The world of royalty was as foreign to him as the moon. "Thank me? It's just a little thing I do." William, the prince, shook his head. "No, it's not just a little thing. We saw what you did this morning. The letters, the buttons. We watched the faces of the people you touched." He paused, looking at the man's hands, the same hands that had guided thousands of journeys. "You spent a lifetime ensuring people arrived safely. And on your last day, you made sure they started their journeys with something more. That's not little. That's everything." Kate stepped closer, her eyes holding his. "My grandmother, the late queen, she would have understood this completely. She had a saying, 'It's the small acts of kindness that weave the fabric of our nation.' You, William, have been weaving that fabric for 40 years without anyone even knowing." A silence fell between them, broken only by the distant hiss of a departing train. The driver's eyes were moist. He had expected a quiet walk out of the station, perhaps a pint with Mr. Davies later. He had not expected this. This validation from two people whose lives were, in their own way, a continuous act of public service, a continuous journey. "I have something for you," Kate said, reaching into her handbag. She pulled out a small, flat box and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a silver lapel pin, a subtle emblem of a wheel and a set of wings, the insignia of the Royal Flying Doctor Service, an organization she patronized that valued quiet, life-saving dedication. "It's not a brass button," she said with a gentle smile, "but it's a token of gratitude from us, for a journey well-traveled." She handed it to him. William the driver took it with trembling fingers, his own brass button from 100 journeys ago, feeling warm in his pocket against his heart. He looked at the pin, then at the two of them, and he felt the final piece of his identity click into place. He wasn't just a retired train driver. He was a man who had given his best, and that best had been seen, honored, and returned to him in a moment he would carry for the rest of his life. Document 3, the photograph that appeared in the newspapers the following morning, was not a posed portrait. It was a candid shot taken from a distance by a passenger on the adjacent platform, slightly blurred at the edges, but its essence was crystalline. In it, the Prince and Princess of Wales stood with a man in a worn flat cap and a blue coat, the massive, soot-stained nose of a locomotive looming behind them. The princess was leaning forward, her hand extended, offering a small box. The prince stood beside her, his posture relaxed, his head tilted in genuine conversation. But the heart of the image was the driver, William. His face was a map of a lifetime, deep lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble, and an expression that was a complex tapestry of surprise, humility, and a profound, unshed tear of joy. The story didn't remain a quiet ripple for long. The local journalist who had been on the train had written a short, restrained piece for his regional paper, focusing on the driver's gesture and the couple's quiet acknowledgement. But it was the photograph that changed everything. It was picked up by a national news wire, its authenticity a sharp contrast to the polished, prearranged images that usually populated the royal pages. The headline writers struggled to encapsulate it. The princess and the train driver, one offered. "A royal salute to a lifetime of service," wrote another. The story, once released, began to grow in the public imagination, not because of the royal involvement, but because of what the royals had recognized. It became a story about work, about the dignity of a job done well, and about the often invisible people who form the backbone of a nation. Social media, usually a cacophony of division, was filled with a rare, unifying sentiment. People shared their own stories of kind strangers, of quiet mentors, of the Williams in their own lives, the postman who always had a biscuit for the dog, the librarian who knew just the right book, the nurse who held a hand a little longer than necessary. For William and Kate, the response was a reaffirmation of a principle they held dear, that their role was not about being distant figures on a balcony, but about being mirrors that could reflect and amplify the goodness they saw in the country. They had not sought the story. The story had found them. And by simply showing up, by being present, they had given a platform that resonated far beyond a single train platform. In Doncaster, Margaret saw her husband's face on the morning news and nearly dropped her cup of tea. William, who had been sleeping off the emotional exhaustion of his final shift, was woken by the phone ringing. Their son from Australia, their daughter from Canada, neighbors, former colleagues. He sat on the edge of the bed, the silver lapel pin from the Princess of Wales in his hand, listening to the incredulous joy in his wife's voice as she read the comments online. He felt exposed, uncomfortable with the attention, but beneath it was a quiet, settling peace. He had done what he had always done. It was the world that had decided to see it differently. A week later, a small, padded envelope arrived at their terraced house. It was addressed in a neat, unfamiliar hand to Mr. William, the train driver. Inside, there was a letter on thick, embossed paper, signed by the princess's private secretary. It expressed their Royal Highness's continued admiration and enclosed a request. The request was for William to consider visiting a local primary school in Doncaster, one that the prince and princess had learned was struggling with funding for its transportation for school trips. They had arranged for a donation in William's name to cover the cost of a new minibus, and they wondered if he might be the one to present it to the children. The ceremony, a few weeks later, was small and unpretentious. William, in a clean shirt and his old flat cap, stood in the school's assembly hall, facing a sea of young faces. Beside him was the shiny new minibus, visible through the hall's large windows. He was nervous, more nervous than he had ever been in a locomotive cab. But when he spoke, the words came from a place he hadn't known existed. He told the children about the letters he had written, about the brass buttons, and about a little boy named Leo on his last journey. He told them that every journey, no matter how small, was important. He told them that the person driving the bus, the teacher leading the class, the parent packing a lunch, they were all part of a team whose job was to help them get to where they needed to go, to learn, to grow, to discover. He pulled from his pocket a small bag. "These are the last of them," he said, holding up a handful of brass buttons, polished to a gleam. "They've seen more miles than I can count. They've kept a lot of trains safe. I'd like you to have them." He walked among them, placing a button in each small, waiting palm. "For your journeys," he said to each child, "wherever they may take you." When he finished, the head teacher stepped forward. She had one more surprise. A letter had arrived that morning, she explained, from Kensington Palace. It was addressed to the children of the school. She opened it and read aloud, her voice clear and steady in the silent hall. It was a short note from the Princess of Wales. She wrote that she had heard about Mr. William's visit and that she wanted the children to know that their journeys mattered. She wrote that the minibus wasn't just a way to get to museums or sports days, but a symbol of possibility. She ended with a simple, powerful line: "Be kind to each other, look after the person next to you, and always remember that the best journeys are the ones we take together." Back in the quiet of their home that evening, William sat with Margaret in their small living room. The brass locomotive model was now polished and displayed on the mantelpiece. Beside it sat the silver pin from the princess, and next to that, a single worn brass button. He wasn't a train driver anymore. He wasn't a national news story. He was William, a man whose lifelong commitment to service had been seen, validated, and transformed into something he could pass on. The story hadn't ended on a platform in Doncaster or at a school assembly. It had rippled outward, touching lives it would never know, a quiet testament to the fact that a heartfelt farewell, offered with sincerity, is never truly an ending. It is simply a new beginning, a legacy set in motion, one small, shining button at a time.